Hello, all. Just a very quick introduction to this special edition of the podcast. This month marked the centenary of the closure of the Monto, Dublin's red light district. The name, of course, coming from Montgomery Street there in the heart of the North Inner City. To mark that, we organised an event as part of the St. Patrick's Festival, held up at TU Dublin in Grange Gorman. What a really beautiful campus and what a great space in which to record a podcast. Amongst my guests, Caroline West, the author of a recent best-selling history of Monto, a sex educator and columnist as well. Terry Fagan, who needs no introduction on this subject. Terry, brilliant oral historian, pioneering figure really of oral history and social history in Dublin, and someone who does brilliant walking tours of the Monto, and be sure to book onto one of them after listening. MacDara Yeates. At the 11th hour, he stepped into the breach. Paula Meehan, the poet, was meant to join me. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to. And MacDara Yeates, singer and cultural programmer, jumped in, and we talked about Monto in song at the very beginning. And speaking of song, two great musical guests on this one, Sean Fitzgerald from the Deadlians and Phelim Drew. Now, I am warning you, this edition of the podcast contains adult language and themes, to put it lightly, and is certainly not suitable for younger listeners. So you have now been warned. And with that, in we go. The End of Monto, a century on. So it's a weird thing, MacDara. It's a place, Monto, that was never really spoken about, but was sang about. There were lots of ballads and songs about this area. And it seems there really is a song, isn't there, for every corner of Dublin, including the dark corners.
Absolutely. I mean, I think there are various quotes that I think are kind of repeated ad nauseum about the Irish song tradition. You know, no revolution is complete without its poetical expression. Those in power write the history, those who suffer write the songs. But you can really see throughout our kind of ballad history that there's an alternative history, not necessarily a reliable one, not necessarily one that's born out of truth in the historical sense, but one which tells another story, maybe an emotional history of this island. And I would argue in the case of the Monto, that really the reason we're all here is that there was a great song written about it. That's not to say people wouldn't be interested in it otherwise, but songs and culture have an amazing way of kind of crystallizing a time and period, immortalizing it and making it relevant. There's a kind of touching story I often remember about during the 1916 Rising. Was a 15-year-old messenger girl named Mary McLaughlin, and she was sent all over the city because she wouldn't be seen as a target to pass messages on behalf of the rebels. And on the last day of the uprising, Mary was sent from Jacobs with a message from Thomas MacDonagh and sent to Plunkett in the GPO to relay the words "yellow bittern." Anyone know what a yellow bittern is? It's a bird. Has anyone ever seen one? No, because they've been extinct in this country for about 250 years. And by the time 1916 had rolled around, the bird had been gone for well over 150 years. And the reason we know anything about yellow bittern is that in the 1600s, an Ulster poet named Cathal O'Gilligan wrote a really stirring poem about one that he found dead on a lake. So the notion that this bird that had long been extinct could still be in people's cultural memory in a language that, let's face it, had long been extinct in the city by that stage, would still be around, I think is a testament to the staying power of songs. And that's, of course, true of the Monto. And
what's surprising with the Monto is it's not as old a song as people might think. A lot of it is about the Boer War, or as they call it, Dublin, the Boer War. But the song is written by this man, Hoddy, the first ever guest on The Late Late Show, quite an eccentric character. And is it fair to say, Take Her Up to Monto is kind of a skit on a folk song?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's probably a consequence of Hodnett's conscience that we even know that he wrote the song, because when he originally approached the Dubliners with it and gave it to them, he presented it as a traditional song. Hodnett's an interesting character, very severe music critic, had no time for folk music in any way, shape or form. He hated the revival. And he had a notion that if you simply wrote a song with a couple of verses, a bit of humour, that it could become an instant hit. Unfortunately, he was correct in this situation. But after a little bit of time, he then admitted to the Dubliners that he had written it himself, and he has since been credited and collected the royalties as a result. Because prior to then, the word traditional was simply a word for it. No one's getting any money for that one.
And he plays it in the Pike Theatre, which had less seats in it than the room we're currently in. And that's where Waiting for Godot got its English language premiere, where Behan burst onto the stage. So it's really this song is born in Bohemian Dublin, I might say.
Absolutely, and I think there's a fascinating seam, I think, between songs we view as contemporarily written and songs that come out of sort of natural oral tradition, if you like. What's nice in this country is that people don't tend to discriminate, really. You know what I mean? If a song is good, people will sing it in the bar rooms or wherever else. You think about the great songs of the Gaiety Theatre, Daffodil Mulligan, Biddy Mulligan, all the rest. These songs assimilate very naturally, and Dubliners aren't snobby about that. You know, they're not examples of songs learnt on your grandmother's knee, but they capture enough of the spirit of the city that people are willing to sing them. I mean, in the case of the Monto, we do have a handful of snatches, really, of songs, more so than entire songs, that are contemporaneous with the place. I'm trying to think of Dominic Behan did an amazing...
Yeah, so Pater Carney, Dominic and Brendan's uncle, is kind of in that area a lot during the revolutionary period. By the way, he's not in the brothels. He's in the pub, Philip Shanahan's pub. He documents it quite well. And then it pops up in Dominic's repertoire.
Yeah. So I'm sure most people in this room will know who Dominic Behan is, but a younger brother of Brendan Behan, and overshadowed mostly, I think, in his work, but really for fans of the Irish song tradition, someone who's left a kind of indelible mark. But Dominic did an amazing album with the great Ewan MacColl, kind of in the early part of his career before he fell out with him. In which he sort of details a lot of the songs of his childhood. A lot of them mention Monto. So there's one amazing one about detailing the living conditions of the people living in the tenements around Monto. It goes, the stair in our house has no floorboards. The lobby is just a big hole. And Murphy has burned down the hall door to mean for to send out for coal. In Monto you can't wash your lobby. 'Tis only with lodgers too full, and if you walk too near the landing, you'll fall down and open your skull. Oh, your L1's a lavatory cleaner. Your Alpha is terrible annoying. He sits in the public with porter. Your knickers have never been clean. You know, so you thank you very much. But going back to what you're saying, you know, there's not an official history in these songs, but there's probably more. There's more record of anything you could find about what the people really lived through in them. I'm also fascinated about the Monto is that we have some evidence that songs were sung there. I mean, you mentioned Pater Carney. He wrote an amazing poem called "Down in the Village," which actually was a kind of send-up of the singing pubs around Monto, and how singing was a very regular occurrence in those places. But there's some evidence that various songs would find their way in, usually by travelling visitors. So in the California Gold Rush, a lot of songs were written about that period, songs of hope, sailors heading off to sea, hopes of finding their riches on that far distant shore. One example of which is... Row, boys, row to California. There's lots of gold, so I've been told, down in the Sacramento, i.e. the Sacramento River in California, the northern part there, just north of San Francisco. However, this song clearly came off a ship somewhere in the mouth of a soldier and was heard by the kids around Montgomery Street, because their version was, I fell into a box of eggs, doo-da, doo-da, and all the yolk ran down me legs, doo-da, day. Row, boys, row to California. There's lots of gold, so I've been told, down in the streets of Monto.
Brilliant.
You know, because I mean, everyone has their own way of kind of updating material and making it their own. And beyond that, I mean, Monto finds its way being mentioned in various songs, a lot of which are written around the middle of the 20th century. The songs of Pete St. John, you think of a song called Johnny McGorry. Hey, Johnny McGorry, where's your old leg gone? I saw you, sorry. Hey, Johnny McGorry, tell me, where's your glory gone? I saw you up in the Monto with your old leg gone. It seemed at a certain point, the Monto was something as Dublin as Molly Malone. It was something that the more you mentioned it in your songs, it lent a certain authenticity to it, and it spoke to a grittier Dublin that I think Dubliners really resonated with, yeah.
When we're talking later on with Caroline and Terry, we get into how Monto is also night town in the memory of Dublin. It's eternally part of Joycean Dublin. You don't see too many Joyceans wandering around that part of the city on the 16th of June, unfortunately. I'd rather stand outside Davy Byrne's and get pissed. But In Ulysses, we meet the character of Buck Mulligan, who is very obviously thinly disguised Oliver St. John Gogarty. He spent plenty of time in the Monto, to put it lightly. He captures it in poem, because it's not just song, there's also poems inspired by that area, and in his case, by very direct research.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think today we're going to chat a wee bit about the treatment of women in the Monto, and it's great to laugh about it, it's great to joke about it, but I mean, I think history will tell us women weren't treated great during that time or afterwards, and I'd love to say that Oliver St. John Gogarty, or Buck Mulligan, whatever you want to call him, was a feminist in his day, but he wasn't really. Do you know what I mean? He was someone who sort of wrote about the time in as raucous and body of fashion as was his wont. Not as raucous in body as maybe his greater contemporary James Joyce, but he does write a kind of fascinating poem lamenting the closure of Monto, which I believe has happened about 100 years ago this month. Is that right?
Indeed.
I'll confirm that with the historian. But it's a beautiful little poem, beautiful in various senses of the word, called The Hay Hotel. And from what I understand, the Hay Hotel refers to a lot of those old brothel houses were effectively turned into horse stables after the time had happened. And some of them were piled so high with hay that you'd go by and all you would see was just the hay piled up, 10 and 11 feet high. And this is his sort of lament for those lost days. The Hay Hotel by Oliver St. John Gogarty. There is a window stuffed with hay, like herbage in an oven cast. And there we came at break of day to soothe ourselves with light repast. And men who worked before the mast, and drunken girls delectable, a future symbol of our past, you'll maybe find the Hay Hotel. Where are the great kip bullies gone, the bookies and outrageous hooers, whom we so gaily doted on when youth was mine and youth was yours? Tyrone Street of the crowded doors, and faithful place so infidel, it matters little who explores, he'll only find the Hay Hotel. Dick Lynon was a likely lad, his back was straight, has he gone down? And for a pal, Jem Plant he had, whose navel was like half a crown. They were the talk of all Mechtown, and Nora Seymour loved them well. Of all their haunts of lost renown, there's only left the Hay Hotel. Fresh Nelly's gone, and Mrs. Mac, Maya Blong's gone, and number 5, where you could get so good a back, and drinks were so superlative. Of all their nights, oh man alive, there is not left any oyster shell. Where greens are gone, the greys will thrive. There's only left the Hay Hotel. There's nothing left but ruin now, where once the crazy cabfuls roared, where new-come sailors turned the prow, and loved-logged cattle dealers snored. The room where old Luke Murphy hoard, the stain on which John Elwood fell, some things are better unencored. There's only left the Hay Hotel. Where is Piano Mary Say, who dwelt where Hell's gates leave the street, and all the tunes she used to play along your spine beneath the sheets? She was a morsel passing sweet, and warmer than the gates of hell. Who tunes them now between the feet? Go ask them at the Hay Hotel. Nay, never ask this week, fair lord, if where they are now all goes well. So much depends on bed and board. They give them in the Hay Hotel.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So MacDara Yeates learned he was on the bill this morning at 10:15. I produced all of that. Thank you so much for putting this event and the events he put together every year into the Patrick's Festival. And he's too modest to plug it himself, but he just released a brilliant record called Traditional Singing from Dublin. So when you go home, give that a listen. But a Boolabus from MacDara Yeates. So from Hoddy, we'll hit the next image. He did Oliver St. John Gogarty a big favour there. He took out some very dirty lines and replaced them. One of my favourite books of recent years in terms of the social history of Dublin is this one, a bestseller of recent weeks from Caroline West. Please give her a big Boolabus and a welcome up to the stage. Caroline, I think you can tell a lot about a writer and the spirit of a book by the dedication, and your book is dedicated to the women and girls of Monto. And it strikes me, from the very beginning of this process, you wanted to put the women of this story right down to the title
front and center?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a world where we just heard men's stories. It was only about 10 years ago I learned that women were involved in the Easter Rising. I thought it was just men. So I was like, all that history is just, it's missing. And when you throw sex into the mix, it's extra missing. Even though we're all obsessed with it and we all talk about it all the time, we think about it, but we just don't like talking about it in public sometimes. But those women's stories are so important, you know, like I did my PhD in porn in DCU, which was weird. It was very, very, very odd. And I was just like, I was struck by it of how, you know, when we talked about those women, even the porn stars, we were like, oh, they're all abused as kids. They're all this, they're all that, they're all uneducated. And I was like, where's your proof for this? And they're like, oh, we just made all that up. Because they're the wrong women, you know? They're seen as people that we don't really need to talk to. We'll make the decisions for them. And, you know, there's power and class and structure, all those, you know, dynamics that are there. And I just think, you know, the more I got into this, the more I was like, those women's stories are so important, because we finally now learned what was going on in the Magdalen laundries, you know, what was being done to women in mother and baby homes, forced vaccinations against kids in, you know, on all these areas, and we didn't talk about it. And I remember being at the Mansion House when the Justice for Magdalens came in, and it was so powerful. Everyone was standing in the streets clapping them. And there were all these, like, you know, 80-odd-year-old women who were like, Jesus, like, what's going on and stuff. But, like, they were so proud. And I was like, yeah, these stories need to be told. We need to have that full picture. Because it's great that we can talk about the songs that men wrote and what men did to the women, but we need to talk to the women and see how they felt about everything. And, you know, just because they sold sex doesn't mean they're any less human or any less deserving of rights and humanity, but we take it away from women in this situation.
It is a history book, but it's also a book that's very shaped by your work. Somebody who writes about sex academically, and you're a columnist in the papers too. So you're writing about the women of a century ago. It's really interesting how today impacts on this book, and even in how we describe these workers, because we forget that ultimately we are talking about workers in the city of Dublin, in a city that had very little industry for women. This was one of the oldest.
Absolutely. Like for the women of Monto, you know, people might think, oh, it's glamorous brothels, and it was at the start in many cases, but the women came there out of necessity a lot of the time, because a lot of them were fleeing the famine. After the famine, you know, land control became very, very important, but then it was generally just passed to the men. So if you have like 6 daughters, what are you going to do? You know, where are they going to go? So they didn't have a lot of educational opportunities. National schools only came in about 1831, I think. They didn't... they didn't do exams for girls until almost the end of the century, because they were like, you guys will just be housewives, it's grand. You'll just teach you how to sew, that's all you need. And then if they did get other jobs, it was normally in factories where it was just really precarious and filthy and dirty, and there was a high risk of sexual violence. Or they could be domestic servants in private homes as a nanny or a cleaner, but again, sexual violence and extreme precarity, because if they got pregnant, they would be kicked out. So you're automatically then homeless and unemployed straight away. So what are you going to do? There is no welfare state. You know, you have to eat, you have to survive. And plenty of people were more than happy to take advantage of that desperation.
Yeah, you mentioned domestic servants. They're the single biggest group of female workers in the 1901 census, the 1911 census, which is amazing. And then you look at Belfast, where you have, like, Manchester is Cottonopolis, Belfast is Linenopolis, where women have good options in the workplace. You don't get the emergence of a Monto in Belfast. People sometimes say, oh, good Protestant men wouldn't be going into the Monto. You wouldn't get one in the shipyards of Belfast. No. But it's an economic question, isn't it, ultimately? And why this happens.
It's, you know, a lot of women, and even nowadays, you know, like a lot of sex work is like, because you got to put food on the table for Christmas, or because you got to go buy a communion outfit, because communions these days are like $1,000, you know, and you got to get bouncy castles and all that kind of thing. And it's like, that's the pressure that's there. But now a lot of the people doing sex work are kind of the same as in Monto. There's still people who've been, you know, through the wars in life. There are migrants coming in. There are people in precarious situations a lot of the time. So yes, there is absolutely amazing sex work, and everything's consensual, and it's high-class escorts, and everything's fantastic. But there is that entire spectrum of people who will just dip in and out, or people, they'll be in it for 20 years, or people who are trafficked in. So you can't talk about sex work and prostitution is just one thing. It's so different, and even though like with the women in Monto, like they didn't have a whole lot of choice societally, socially, or economically, but they still had agency within that choice too, and that's still the same today. There might be people who maybe necessarily don't want to do what they're doing, but there's still choice in that as well. So we have to be very careful not to be like, this person is this or this.
Yeah.
Because it's every human experience.
Before you get into Monto in the book, you give a kind of potted history of selling sex in Dublin, and there's the famous or the infamous characters Peg Plunkett, whose memoirs put the absolute fear of God into the men of Dublin. When they heard that the most famous brothel owner in the city was writing her memoirs, there was a panic. I think some men left the city, wondering if they'd be in it. Later, you have Grafton Street. That's mad, isn't it? At one point, Grafton Street is the centre of prostitution in Dublin. A letter writer complains to the papers, let us put half a dozen men from the G Division, the intelligence police, parading Grafton Street at the hours of 4 to 6. This was found successful in Sackville Street during last summer, and I've no doubt we shall soon be free of these social pests and can again escort our wives and daughters through one of our finest streets. People didn't like the fact that prostitutes were visible on Grafton Street, on O'Connell Street. I think Monto was kind of a solution for citizens like our letter writer there. If they couldn't see it, they didn't have to think about it.
Absolutely. And that was a huge part of why it moved over to Monto, because the brothels were all family homes that turned into slums then, because it was poor at that time. So what a red light district needs is opportunity. Monto had that in spades. You had the British Army barracks, and wherever there's British soldiers, there's a lot of stuff going on, shall we say. And then you had the dock workers. Then you had all the people coming up from Connolly Station. You had all the people who'd be in the main street, Sackville Street. But then you also had anonymity. That's the word, where you could just dip in and out. And that was very important. So the Victorians were like the weirdest bunch of people. They were just such hypocrites all the time. So they were like, oh, no, like sex is terrible, but it's a necessary evil for men.
Oscar nailed them, didn't he?
Yeah.
Society knew the price of everything and the value of nothing. There you go. They didn't mind what happened once it was happening out of.
Absolutely. Like, and we still do that now. Like, we still pretend sex work doesn't happen, or that the homeless crisis isn't like the worst thing in the world. And like we still pretend, oh, everything's fine. But then when you scratch the surface, you see all that underneath it. But I think, like, the circumstance of Monto being what it was that Victorian era of like, we'll hide it, we'll tolerate it, but we'll judge the women who don't go into it. So the women who didn't go in were good women because they tolerated their husbands going in. So they caught the good kind of syphilis, which was passed from your husband. So they had victim status. So they would go into the hospitals and be treated differently, or they had private doctors, so they didn't even have to go into the hospitals. Whereas the women in Monto were viewed as the spreaders. So they were the dangerous ones. Their bodies were dangerous. Their body fluids were dangerous. Those poor men were just innocent victims of those wrong women. But when they'd go into the hospital, they'd get segregated. They'd have to wear different clothes because they were viewed as also morally contagious. So like the Victorians in Dublin at that time, they didn't want to deal with the sex. They didn't want to deal with those morals, the drinking, everything like that. And because the Catholic Church and the state really started to become best friends at that stage, the idea that women could be having sex outside of marriage, not for procreation, it wasn't happening. So it was all squished away.
And even sometimes progressive women, like the suffragettes, the Irish Citizen newspaper, or women coming them on, sometimes in their memoirs they talk about how one side of O'Connell Street, respectable women would walk on and the other side was prostitutes. These are women who are broadly liberal socially in their thinking, but even they have this view towards these women. So it's not just coming from the church, it's coming even from the suffragette left and other people who
But even
view
Florence
these women.
Nightingale, who did amazing nursing stuff and was actually impacted by her trips to Dublin to see the slums. That's why she got into nursing. She wanted the syphilis really looked at and the cure developed, not because she cared about the women, because she was infecting her male patients of the soldiers. So she was like, we'll get rid of them, we'll protect these are the good ones. So she looked down on them as well, rather than saying, can you see the circumstances that they're living in? You know, they're just trying to survive, and syphilis was horrendous at that time. But yeah, fancy women were like, no, these are still bad women.
When you Google Monto, there are two things that come up. One, Monto lyrics, and then second, where was Monto? And at the very beginning of your book, you give us a map, and you've mentioned the British Army presence. Irish nationalists used to call venereal disease the British disease. Monto stayed open for a few years after the British left, but we were happy enough to go too. But the train station is there. It's a perfect storm, really, isn't it? And you write about the platform of Amiens Street train station as a place of kind of vulnerability where women from the country could find themselves enticed into Monto.
Absolutely. Like that stage, once that woman has made that decision to make it to Dublin, to escape whatever she's escaping, and a lot of the time it wasn't just the famine, it was interfamily violence, it was domestic violence, sexual violence, incest. There were newspaper reports daily of incest where men were like, but she's my daughter, she's just a stand-in for my wife, like what's the big deal? So you can see why they'd want to leave. But then when they arrive there, they might have all those hopes and dreams of like, maybe I might get a job here or a job here. But the second they touched down on that platform, it was like if they were peak kind of grabbing, I suppose, fresh meat for the bully boys who'd bring them into the brothels, or be targeted by nefarious things. So, you know, a lot of the times that moment of standing there is like she can either make her fortune or she's going to end up on the streets, you know. So it was a real liminal space, you know, had potential. And loads of the women in Monto did really well, you know. They got money, they got their husbands, and then they left, you know. A lot of the times they married their clients, or their clients would be regular dock workers going over to the UK and back and forth. And then they'd come home and then they'd move on. So that platform became that symbol of this could go either way. You could have a great time, or it could be horrendous, or it's going to be a mixture of everything, which is more likely.
And there's social class division, even within Monto, in terms of the different kinds of brothels that are in this area. So you have a term in the book, it's worth explaining to people, a flash house.
Yes.
Now, what's the difference between a brothel and a flash house?
So flash, again, everything in sex work is stratified by class. You know, you have people on the street, and then you have people in €2 million dungeons and all this weird and wonderful stuff going on inside. And you had that in Monto as well, or in every sex work. You have professional courtesans. Like Peg Plunkett was so proud of being like the biggest madam in Ireland. So, you know, that stratification by class, there's one peg, but there's probably 1,000 other pegs that will never know their stories, or maybe even like tens of thousands.
And some women who end up in Monto perhaps for longer than they had initially intended would move from those flash houses with the very famous madams who ran them, I suppose, through the lower orders of the district, which is...
Yeah, if you're arriving and you're the fresh new thing and, you know, you're looking great and everything's fantastic, then you're going to be in high demand. But, you know, the longer you stay in violent situations, and especially with sexual violence, and they face violence from everywhere. They face violence from the madams, violence from the bully boys, violence from clients, and violence from society as well. Like, they didn't have anywhere to go, and the longer they stayed in Monto, the less likely they were to go to one of the asylums, because the asylums only wanted to take freshly fallen women who had only kind of done a little bit. So if they'd spent years in Monto, there was no help for them then. That's when they would have really needed it the most. So when syphilis kind of started really taking hold of a lot of the girls, it left marks all over their faces. People used to wear, not necessarily a Monto, but a couple of hundred years before, they used to wear like fake noses because their noses would fall off with syphilis. The history of syphilis is fascinating. It's
the numbers are in your book.
Insane. Yeah.
In 1850, there were 3,000 reported infections of syphilis in Dublin hospitals from soldiers.
Yeah. So they spread it around everywhere they went. So all the soldiers of the British Empire passed through Monto, but they would look at syphilis from, say, Asia as like, oh, that's more deadly, because it was like just racist as well.
But this is like how the Spanish flu spreads after the First World War.
Yeah.
And soldiers are on the move.
All
syphilis does
oh, it's the soldiers. Like, I'm sure COVID has some soldier thing in it somewhere or something as well.
It's a good argument to keep Irish military neutrality.
Yes, definitely. But the sergeants of the soldiers were like, oh, there's no syphilis in our regiment. And you're like, statistically speaking, no, like that's not happening. And then they would inject themselves as well with like milk and stuff to try and look like they had syphilis, because they wanted to get out of having to go to the front line, because they knew that was certain death. So they're like, if we can stave that off for a couple of months, it's worth the injection into your urethra.
Well, I was amazed by reading your book. Sexual health is a big part of this story, and we think condoms arrived in Ireland in like 1981 or something. We're wrong. You have an extraordinary article from the archives a century ago this year, 1925. A journalist writes of how rubber goods can be had without difficulty. The only difference between Dublin and English cities in this respect is that here they're not publicly exposed for sale in attractive shop windows. And there are other means of protection too. And even, I was amazed by this, circulating pamphlets about sexual health. So presumably the women themselves would have been circulating information on sexual health.
Absolutely. And so people wanted to know how they could manage their fertility, because people have always wanted to know that. So in Irish society, there used to be handy women who'd go around communities and say, here's the herbs you need to take for abortions and all that kind of thing. But at that time in Dublin, there was a pamphlet written by the Quakers, actually, and that was kind of sex isn't that bad, maybe just be respectful and, nice, and maybe people should control their fertility. So that was quite positive and great. But a lot of them were we know of the existence of them through rants about them. So it's people writing into newspapers and medical journals saying, this is disgraceful, it's going to encourage everyone to have sex.
And then everyone else we're going to get it.
Yeah, exactly. They're
the vigilance
where's it going?
associations would condemn something and everyone would read it.
Absolutely. And the women of Monto had better contraception than women of Ireland have had for about 60 odd years, because contraception was banned in the 1930s. So up to that point, they did have condoms, they did have diaphragms, they did use pigs' intestines as well to try and keep birth control going as well. And they had abortion, and they had the Granny Dunleavy who was offering abortions and help with childbirth, but also telling the girls about their periods and about things like STIs. So she's one of our first sex educators. And she needs that honor, because she didn't just help the girls, she stood up to the church and state as well that were saying, no, you're not allowed to do this. We're going to control sexuality and fertility. So, some of the women's actions might seem small, but that's standing up against a patriarchal state when at that time that would get you locked up in a laundry, possibly forever. And that's the guts that took, to do that and to stand up, not just to church and state, but to the madams and to the bully boys and make sure those women had that information. It's incredible work, and she needs to be honoured for that, because we honour other people who've done work in Irish society, and it's she saved so many women's lives. Not just that, she gave them dignity, dignity and autonomy and choice over their own bodies, and that's just magic,
I'll be talking to Terry later about the closure of Monto and how that came about. But towards the end of your book, you get to the question of ethical remembrance, which is a very a difficult thing, because there are other difficult histories in that immediate streetscape. There's a Magdalene Laundry story to be told there as well. There are challenges and great potential as well in how we tell the story of the Monto in the Monto.
Absolutely. And what I love, we have Terry here, you can go to Monto, do a Monto tour with Terry, who's super passionate and speaks about it as if it's actually happening, and you're just carried along with it, and it's fantastic. But you're on those same cobblestones, and Terry plays his recordings of the people talking about it, and there's just it makes my veins just pop with excitement of hearing all that. And it is part of that ethical remembrance of you listen to people's stories, you listen, you find the words, you find the people involved in it. And we've no plaque there, we don't remember sex workers in Ireland, we're barely even remembering the Magdalene Laundry victims, and most of those were sex workers as well, and that's erased too. So there's a great graveyard in London called Crossbones, and there's some mad story now about a magical goose. I wasn't getting into that part of it. I was just okay. A goose came to him in a dream or something. I was okay. But they found the graveyard doing works on the tube, and then discovered it had been a working class graveyard. So lots of sex workers and people from workhouses. And they found the skull of a 6-year-old girl who had not been born with syphilis, or no, she's a teenager, but she'd been infected with syphilis at 6. And then repeatedly infected. So that's from sexual activity, because she wasn't born with it. And all those people were just dumped into that mass grave there. And so now they remember it. They tidied up the grave. They hang little ribbons on it. They've made it a magical place. And they do a monthly vigil that you can look at online. And they say, we remember the outcasts and the people who weren't welcome in society. And it's that's lovely and powerful. And it's not saving them, it's just giving them space to exist. I think if we come in and go, we're going to save everyone, we're going to be the saviors, you're not listening to the people then. So you have to meet people where they're at. And so I just think the more we have those voices and those first-person centered approaches, that's how we remember people and how we learn from the past to look at the people who are in the same situations now.
Absolutely. So we find some history in the numbers, and we crunch some of the numbers today, but it's the first-hand testimonies that people like Terry were able to save that should be the fore in how we recall Monto.
100%. And there's so many different ways. Unfortunately, we can't talk to a lot of the women in Monto because they were silenced. You know, they went into the laundries and everything else, and their names were taken from them. They were told he can't talk about the past, or they weren't capable of talking because death by syphilis is, you're all very lucky it's just a course of antibiotics now. It was grim, it was horrendous, and their stories were forgotten about then. So it's really important because it left them just so vulnerable to violence. So if we just talk about these people and we don't see them as people, we're just like, sex workers, prostitutes, dirty women, sluts, whores, all these things that have been leveled against us for years for daring to enjoy our own sexuality or monetize it or do whatever we wanted with our bodies. And it's like, that's not okay. And we're not going back to that. And these stories have absolutely as much right to be heard as any other story from some high fancy class lady who did amazing stuff or whatever. Their stories matter, definitely matter.
So congratulations to you on what was a #1 bestseller, non-fiction best-selling book. Be sure to pick it up. We're going to have our first musical act. Well, MacDara was a musical act, I suppose. He broke into song a few times. Our first programmed musical act of the event is Sean Fitzgerald from the Deadlians. Please give him a big boon of us.
So I was thinking that I'll do a song from the precursor to Monto, Hell, around between Fishamble Street and Wine Tavern Street below Christchurch. And you probably have all heard the story of various different stories of Darky Kelly and Simon Luttrell and everything like that. And then I'll do a song that has a kind of association with Monto. What do you think of that? I once knew a family living near hell. If they're not gone away, they're living there still with me. Wick, Fally, Fallickety, followed all day. Oh, comes the devil to the man with the plough, saying, one of your family I must have now with me. Wick, Fally, Fallickety, followed all day. And now says the farmer, I am undone. For you surely come for my eldest son with me. Wick, Fally, Fallickety, followed all day. And now says the devil, I've come for your wife. For I hear she's a plague tormenting your life with me. Wick, Fally, Fallickety, followed all day. So he hoisted the lady up on his back, and down to hell with her he did jump with me. Wick, Fally, Fallickety, followed all day. He carried her till they came to Cute Hill. She cried as much there as a thorn a mill with a Wick, Fally, Fallickety, followed all day. He carried her till he came to hell's wall. And there she did stutter and stammer and fall with me. Wick, Fally, Fallickety, followed all day. There was two little devils playing with chains. She up with a stick and she bust out the blaze with me. Wick, Fally, Fallickety, followed all day. There was one little devil playing a ball. saying, take her away, daddy, she'll murder us all with me wick folly, follickety folladaldane. So is it true the women are worse than the men? For they go down to hell and I kicked out again with me wick folly, follickety folladaldane. Will I do another song or was I talking to you? Huh?
That was your Newport Folk Festival moment.
Bastard totally threw me off there, you know? Well, where was I in the story? I can't remember. This is how these things get lost, man, you know?
Each generation of the Hellfire Club being a worse bastard than the last. But no, Maurice Curtis's book is called From Hell to Monto.
Oh, yeah, amazing.
But
yeah.
what's the second song? You song
well, I could do I was thinking that I could do the Waxy Dargle because I mentioned
yes,
the
of course, you mentioned Monto.
Yeah. Says my old one to your old one, would you go to the Waxy Dargle? Says your old one to my old one, I haven't got a fan. I went down to Monto town to ask the money lantern, but he wouldn't lend me the half a crown. And the old man's red suspenders. What will you have? I'll have a pint. I'll have a pint with you, son. And if one of you doesn't order soon, you'll be thrown out of the boozer. Says you're old one and my old one. Would you go to the Galway races? Says your old one and my old one, with the price of me own lads' braces. I went down to Capel Street to ask the money lender, but he wouldn't give me the half a crown. And the old lad's red suspenders. What'll you have? I'll have a pint. I'll have a pint with you, sir. And if one of you doesn't order soon, you'll be thrown out of the boozer. Cause your old one to my old one, we have no beef nor mutton. If we go down to the night town, you might get a drink for nothing. Here's a nice piece of advice I got from a fishmonger. When food is scarce and you see the hearse, you know you died of hunger. What'll you have? I'll have a pint. I'll have a pint with you, sir. And if one of you doesn't order soon, you'll be thrown out of the booth. Hey, thank you. Thank you.
So, plugged MacDara's record earlier on. Plug Sean's band, the Deadlians. They're brilliant. They have a great song called I Don't Want to Ride Your L1 Anymore. And the first verse goes, I don't want to ride your L1 anymore. Riding your L1's like going to war. Give me a tenner and we'll call it a score, but I don't want to ride your L1 anymore. Can we hit the next slide, which is corporation buildings in the heart of the Monto. I went down to Monto town, as you just heard from Sean. And a big boola bus, please, for Terry Fagan. So Terry, for you, life began
in there, yeah.
in the historic area of Dublin, the Monto, the corporation buildings, growing up in Monto, it was, I suppose, something that still lingered in the lore of the area when you were growing up there.
Yeah, it was. I was born there, actually, in Corporation Buildings there, and that photograph was actually taken because some of the kids, now just switching a bit away, some of the kids used to hide up on the rooftops from when he broke out of the industrial schools, and that photograph there would depict some of the kids that were up there at one stage, right? You know. But yeah, I was born in the area, in the Monto area, and I grew up with some of the stories that was told about it. Now I didn't know too much about it, and basically how I got involved with documenting the area was I used to do, before the Meals on Wheels were ever kind of thought about, this nun used to get some food out of all places, out of the GPO canteen in O'Connell Street there. And we used to bring the food up to the tenement houses that were along Sean McDermott Street, Garner Street, Summer Hill, and down around Foley Street. And when I was in the house, people always wanted to talk, because the families had grown up and left, and they were on their own. They'd tell us stories about 1913, 1916, and all that. And so I said, look, I get a recorder, and I start recording the stories. And then from there, I switched on then into the Monto. People talked about the Monto, what they witnessed, and the whole lot. So I started to collect and document it.
Give us a sense of when exactly we're talking about here. What kind of year do you start recording this?
I started recording in 1970. That's when I started.
So it's first-hand memory then?
It's a first-hand memories, yeah. And they were a kind of like, some of them were only children. Some of them were only about 10, 12 years of age when what they remembered in Monto. But some of them were up to 16, some of them were 20 years of age.
Wow.
And they remembered Monto. And one woman in particular, Sarah, who remembered the first madams that was down there. So Monto was run by two sets of madams. You had Mrs. Mac Bellicone and Meg Arnott. And they were the ones that's listed in Joyce's Ulysses. And then after that came the second set of madams, like Becky Cooper, May Oblong, whose real name was May Roberts, and you had Mrs. Mean, Paula Mean's great-grandmother, and you had Mrs. McKenna and various other madams that ran the prostitution in the area.
Amazing.
But when the first set of madams there, what we know of them then was they used to put the nicest looking girls on jaunting cars and send them up around Sackville Street and around all the area and the whole lot. So there was an attempt to close down Monto in around, it came out in the Encyclopedia Britannia, and it stated that here we have in the second city of the British Empire open prostitution taking place. And that kind of shocked, not so much shocked, but mainstream public opinion. And then the Commissioner of Police then was formed, Sir John Ross, the famous Sir John Ross. He took over Commissioner of Police, and then he decided he'd take a chance on closing down the Monto, going after them. See, what he did, when Monto was run there, the madams had everything to a T. The brothels in Monto were in first class, second class, third class, and shilling houses. In the first class, as Caroline said, there was lace curtains, there was music, there was this and that. But what they had in the rooms was a medical certificate for when the men went in, saying, this is Mary so-and-so, she is free from venereal diseases, signed Dr. Murphy. But Dr. Murphy never existed, right? They were written out by medical students who were down in the Monto, who were who were writing these out and getting the free drink and getting away with the women. But anyway, so John Ross then took on the role of trying to close down the Monto. But what he found out was that the madams, when they were running the prostitution there, obviously there was no phones, well, I'm saying phones in many ways, but they had lookout men. They were known as the whistlers. And the sole job was, the first people would stand at the corner there, was now James Joyce Street, looking over towards Stour Street. And what they would do is watch for police movements coming in. And all through Monto, through the corners, all these men stood, and they were given their drink and they were given their food, and they stayed there, and that was their positions. Now, they didn't sound the alarm should the police come over in ones and twos. That was okay. But should they come over in force, they'd whistle to one another. And then those nearest to the brothels would bang on the doors. They're coming in force, get the clients out. Now, I was in some of the underground tunnels in Monto, and I found Victorian coins, gas lamps, paraffin oil lamps, bits of beds and bits of things. So we had them in the museum that we did have. And so some of these, when I asked people about these secret underground tunnels in Monto, they said, well, some of them were the round showers you see on the street. Those for putting the fuel down for heating the Georgian houses. Some of them were knocked into one another. So the clients would have time to go down into the basement, step through a couple of them and come out a few doors down.
Wow.
You know?
Is the funny you mentioned James Joyce Street, that
Yeah.
one of the only people who's actually commemorated the streetscape of Monto before you came along and put
Yeah.
up plaques was a former punter.
Yeah.
And a street's named in honour of a former punter
Yeah.
from Monto. Oral history, your tool, it's very much a people's history. For me, I think of two names in the story of modern Dublin oral history. Kevin Kearns from North Colorado. He wrote Dublin Tenement Life, a masterpiece. But you began with the North Inner City Folklore Project. The game has changed in a lot of ways. You've got the very modern-looking contraption there.
Yeah.
All of these interviews, I mean, they're in boxes, they're in all kinds of places, but you're trying to digitize them bit by bit.
I have a lot of them. Maybe hundreds of interviews, right? All different stories. You can name it, we have it. A lot of the stuff would be to do with women in the tenements, men at work on the docks, industrial schools, children being sent away. Anything that we could think of, we recorded, and they're all there. Now, we did have a museum on Railway Street, which was brilliant. And with all the original artefacts. I even have the gramophone, belongs to one of the madams, Madam May Oblong. Her real name was, as I said, was May Roberts. But we have her gramophone, and how we got that was, there was a woman who used to clean the houses for her. She was a local woman. And she used to do all the cleaning, but when May Oblong died, that was given to her as a present. And then it was given to the families, and they threw her up into an attic. He didn't want it. So I was approached and said, look, we have a gramophone belongs to May Oblong. Would you like it? And I said, maybe I wouldn't. So they gave it to us. And also our records. And the records that was there was John McCormick. And then one of them was A Nation Once Again. So all those recordings are there on various things like
A nation once again playing in the background of a brothel.
Yeah. Now you have it. So, but they talked about Mrs. Dunleavy, right? And she was the midwife.
Count John McCormick, a very religious man.
Yeah, he was. He sung at the 1932 Eucharistic Congress. Now, she talked about Mrs. Dunleavy, known as the Granny Dunleavy. Now, she was there helping the women that were children, because when you're pregnant in the brothels, they were tossed out and onto the streets. And then it was the local people. So when you talk about Monto, not every family was involved in prostitution. The majority of family had nothing got to do with it. But these madams controlled the area just like drug dealers, because they had it all kind of sectioned off where the girls stood in different parts of Monto. But Mrs. Dunleavy used to be called in when the girl was. Sometimes when the girl was thrown out and they couldn't take her into a room, she was made comfortable underneath the stairwell. And he had a thing what was called a polyas or a tick. And what they were flour sacks sewn together and stuffed with straw. And that's what the people slept on in the tenements as well. But that was made there for the women. And then when the woman came time to have the baby, she was brought up into the room, and Mrs. Dunleavy would come and deliver the baby. And once the baby was born, the mother of the child would say to the woman that took her in, would you mind minding me child while I go off and get somewhere to bring the baby to? But once they went out, they never come back. And they became known in the area as the Monto babies. And I did interview a good few of the Monto babies. I didn't ask them about their families. But here's the thing about Mrs. Dunleavy. Mrs. Dunleavy was helping these women. Do you know what her husband was doing? He was making rosary beads in Mitchell's Rosary Bead Factory. So if you Google Mitchell's Rosary Bead Factory, it's the anybody familiar or old enough to remember Charles Mitchell? Well, it was his family that ran the Rosary Bead Factory in the heyday of Monto. And that was still open in 1964. And how I know, because it has a connection to my family. Because my brother was caught stealing rosary beads from there. And the judge gave him 7 years. He was 7.5 years old. And the judge gave him 7 years. Right? And then, there's lots of stories connected to that. There was a man in Monto, the Gunneries from Monto. Jemmy Gunnery, he was a Dublin docker. He set up a network of secretly rescuing children from industrial schools. I played a part in that. I rescued my brother. My brother was rescued out. He was in 3 industrial schools, Artane, Letterfrack and Clonmel. And we rescued him out of Clonmel. And Jemmy wanted to get him to England, but he didn't want to go. So basically, the only way he could survive without being captured was they dressed him up as a girl, right? So he spent 2 years walking the streets of Dublin disguised as a young girl. And the woman that bought him his first dress, Pauline, she's still alive today. She's the last of the women who secretly hid children that gunnery that had rescued. But the Monto area is full of different stories. And it's all these things. Like, I mean, I found some of the stuff we actually found an arm stump in Monto in 1962. There was an old factory down there, and we were playing, a fellow called Mick Forden. I think you might know him, don't you? Okay. And there was a big slab, and we went downstairs underneath the ground, and we found all these rifles and different things. So we were on Foley Street with guns, and then the police came along and confiscated the rest of them. But the area is steeped in history.
Speaking of guns and the Monto, if we hit the next image. Great election poster coming up now. The great Philip Shanahan, Tipperary man.
Yeah.
You've done a lot of work in the Monto, commemorating the revolutionary period and its great contributions. Philip Shanahan, Tipperary man, ran a public house in the midst of it all. Dan Breen remembered Shanahan's as a very important place. He said, the lady prostitutes used to pinch the guns and ammunition from the Ogsies or Tans at night and leave them for us at Philip Shanahan's public house. I might add, Dan said, that there was no such thing as payment for these transactions. Any information they had, they gave us. We think about Monto as part of the history of Dublin prostitution, but it's also part of the history of Dublin's revolutionary period, perhaps because it lured in soldiers.
Yeah, well, basically, like, the biggest clientele into Monto was the British soldiers, right? And they were sleeping with the women in the brothels, and they were gleaming information back and was passed into Will Shanahan's pub. And the women in Monto, it was said by one of the people that I interviewed, and I found it very funny in many ways, but he said the women in Monto done more damage to the British Army than the IRA ever did. Right? So a lot of them were out sick with venereal diseases and whatnot, so they couldn't fight. But the women in Monto played a leading part in basically people be seeing the film Michael Collins and Bloody Sunday. Well, two of Michael Collins' top men, Dick McKee and Peter Clancy, were at a meeting in Bond's Hotel in Parnell Square, and it was Saturday night. It was the night before the execution of the agents, and it was raided. And McKee and Clancy made their way down into Monto, into Phil Shanahan's pub. So they're in there having a drink, and they leave there. They're making their way to a safe house in Gloucester Street, which is today Sean McDermott Street. And as they're going up, they're being followed by a British spy by the name of John Ryan. Now, John Ryan was the brother of one of the madams of Monto, Becky Cooper. So he's following them through the streets, and he follows them to the safe house on Gloucester Street there. And we have a plaque up. The house is still there with a plaque up on it and all. And because I interviewed the man that was there when Dick McKee was there in the house, and Clancy. And so he tipped off the Black and Tans where McKee and Clancy were. So they raided it on a Saturday night around 1 o'clock in the morning. And Mr. Sean Fitzpatrick's son says they pulled up with armoured cars and the searchlights on the building. McKee and Clancy couldn't get out. They had the whole area blocked off. And so they ran up the stairs. They fired shots into the door. They tried to dislodge the door open. They couldn't get it open. So they jumped down into the basement. And here we have a woman called Florence Fitzpatrick. Word is sent down to her. She's staying down in the kitchen part of it. And word is sent down to her to delay the Tans from getting up to give McKee and Clancy a pint of pudding, whatever information they had on them. But she does that. She delays the Tans. Eventually they get through into the building. They arrest McKee, Clancy, and the owner of the thing, Sean Fitzpatrick. They're taken to Dublin Castle. Collins doesn't know anything about this. So Sunday morning comes and the agents are shot around the city. And then David Nelligan informs Collins that McKee and Clancy are in the guard room of Dublin Castle, and he knows their fate. They're going to be killed. And they were killed, along with another guy called Conor Clune, and they were killed in the guard room. So Collins wanted to know how the hell did the British find out the safe house. And then through the women of Monto, they said they seen John Ryan following McKee and Clancy through the streets. So that sealed his fate. So Collins put in he got his intelligence squad to organise to kill him. And that
happens in a pub, isn't it? It's a very dangerous...
Yeah,
the pub was a very dangerous place to be during the Irish Revolution.
It was, but Tom Keogh gives a witness statement, and you can read it online, that he's making his way into Monto. And they're all dressed up, like well dressed. And they're making their way down Gloucester Street, and they're passing by the Old Tin Church, and there's a funeral taking place there. And one of the Jarvis says to Tom Keogh, he's going to this funeral, lads. And Tom Keogh says, no. He said, we're going to create one, right? So anyway, they go down to Hines' pub, which is on the corner of, which now is today's Railway Street, and Lower Gloucester Place. And John Ryan is in there drinking, and they execute him in the pub. And we have 2 eyewitnesses to the shooting. We have them on record. And we've lots of events like that we captured.
It's extraordinary. Yeah, there's a great history blog about deaths in pubs in Dublin historically, and it's called Dying for a Pint. But it touches on the fact that during the War of Independence, especially in the Monto area, these were dangerous places to be. You had soldiers whose guard was down. You had women working whose sympathies may have been towards nationalism. And this pub in the middle, like literally in the centre of everything in Monto, was basically the 3rd Tipperary Brigade of the IRA's Dublin headquarters. Which is amazing.
That was the meeting place for them in there. And everybody turned up in there, like that was there. And but Shanahan was a very decent man. Like, he helped a lot of families who were in the tenements around there. He was a man that couldn't say no. And of course, he helped them a lot. And then basically the IRA used to be in there, and some of them wouldn't have money, wouldn't have buy a drink. He'd give them the free drink, he'd give them this. And what happened to him was, in many ways, was the pub was closed up. When the War of Independence was over and the Civil War started, Cosgrave closed down his pub and took away his licence. And then he gave the licence back when the Civil War was over. He stocked out his pub. And so Phil Shanahan was back in business. But it was too late for Phil Shanahan because the war was over. His friends in the IRA stopped coming to the pub. And then he became a broken man. There was nothing there. So he retreated up into the upstairs rooms. And there, the people in Monto that he did help, they used to bring him his food every day to him and try and keep him going. And then eventually he was taken out there. I think sometime in around 1927, he was taken up to number 13 North Frederick Street. And then from there he was sent down to Tipperary, then where he passed away then.
The closure of the Monto is of course such an important part of the story, and that is why we're at this event, the centenary of it. You've brought with you a recording. We're going to hear it, which is fantastic, about that moment and the symbolic end of Monto. And it really is a moment of high symbolism when Monto was closed down by, I mean, on paper it's closed down by the police, but it's orchestrated very much by the Legion of Mary and Frank Duff. Can we hear that recording?
You can, yeah.
But I'm going to edit this out of the podcast. But where did you get that piece of equipment? Tell me where you got that piece of equipment. It's amazing. No, you never guess.
No, I can't think of the bedside at the moment. Hang on, just move this back a bit.
About the time that the clergy in Marlborough Street decided that they would go up, and I don't know how he described it, but I suppose it was to drive the prostitutes and their lot out of that area. And they marched from the Pro Cathedral, praying and singing hymns, and he was at the front there with the cross, the crucifix, and he carried that up to Monto. I remember that distinctly. I remember him telling me distinctly about that.
So basically, what happened there was he was Mr. Russell carried the cross into Monto, and he was basically he was locked out during the lockout, and then was blacklisted, and so he ends up being a singer in the Pro Cathedral Church, and it's Frank Duff comes to him, and he introduces him around the area trying to help him. So what brought Frank Duff into Monto? It's an amazing story, because William T. Cosgrave and the Free State government gave Frank Duff a building, 76 Harcourt Street, and then they gave him a cheque for about £50 or £25, in around that, and they cleaned out the building. It was actually the building Collins used for an intelligence as well. And they cleaned out the building, and they set it up as the first Sancta Maria hostel for women. And so Duff is the lawyer, he's helping all these women on the south side of the city. And he's in the hostel one evening, and he's told 2 of the women have left, and they're gone down into Monto. And then he decides there's no point of tackling prostitution in the city when it's rampant in the biggest part of the thing. So he announces in there that he's going to come down to try and rescue the women. And the former prostitutes tell Frank Duff, "Don't go down there, Mr. Duff," he said, "because we found dead, you'd be a throat cut in a laneway." Now, if you look at the newspapers now, we have the book, which is it's Monto. Monto Madam's more than Black Cottle. It's available now in Connolly bookshops. But in the newspaper reports, you see one of the first madams slits a sister's throat with a razor. These madams carried cutthroat razors. The pimps in Monto carried lead pipes and cutthroat razors. They were really dangerous people, right? So Frank Duff comes into the area and he tries to help these women, and he takes on the fact that he knows they could be killed, but he still goes in. And then he goes in 1923, in February of 1923. He's introduced to one of the madams who he's told she's not a madam anymore. She collects money and gives it to the church and to the charities. But Frank Duff finds out that she collects the money off the women and sends it to the church in her own name and to the orphanages. And he stops that. But he goes in to rescue the girl, and eventually he does rescue the girl that he's looking for, and she ends up in the famous Lock Hospital. She lives for about 3 months after he rescued her. And then when she dies, some of the former prostitutes from the Santa Maria Hostel walk behind her hearse out the glass in heaven, and some of the prostitutes from Monto also go there. So Frank Duff, no one tried to kill Frank Duff. He goes back into the area, and what he's doing is buying the women back off the madams. How much does she owe you? How much debt is she in? And then he's getting them out, and he's bringing them over to the Santa Maria Hostel and try and get them up. So it's now 1925, and he's still doing the same thing. So what he does then, he meets the priest who's on there. He's going to just take us up with this for a second.
But while you're doing that, just to say, like, in terms of people who don't like Frank Duff and how he operates, John Charles McQuaid is very critical of Frank Duff, and I think Frank Duff is a far more decent man at his core than McQuaid ever was. Yeah,
well, Frank Duff, John Cooney in the book about McQuaid, he says Frank Duff, like he stood up to McQuaid when he opened the Sanctum, the Regina Chaley Hostel for mothers and babies. McQuaid wanted the women in the laundries and the babies put somewhere else. But Duff stood his ground. And he actually was against children going into the industrial schools as well. But we know that he took on those madams in Monto. And then eventually, how he forced the priest to this priest that he knew was going to, in this is 1925, he's going to do a religious retreat in the Pro Cathedral. And Duff says, look, why don't you make Monto the central theme of the retreat, condemn the madams for what they're doing to these women. And so the priest agrees. So Frank Duff was also a member of the Vincent de Paul. So he gets his Legion of Mary and the Vincent de Paul to go around the tenements and everywhere else, and he tell them that the madams of Monto are going to be condemned for what they're doing from these for these women. So the retreat is on. Word is coming back to the madam saying, you hear the priests are condemning you from the pulpit. They say you're going to burn in hell for what you're doing to those women. So the madams were scared. They weren't scared of the DMP police, the RIC police, or the British Army or anybody else, but they were scared of the power of the church. So the madams then, Frank Duff found that the madams were wobbly about it. So he set up a meeting in the Belvedere Hotel, and they summons all the madams to come to meet him. The first madam come up was Paula Meehan's great-grandmother. She said, what do you want? And they said, we want you to close those houses you run for moral purposes. And she said, oh, thank God you asked me to do that. I always wanted to do it. Now, she said, but now I can do it now, and I can reconcile myself with the church. And she tells Frank Duff that she will dress those women from head to toe, provided they go to the hostel, right? So that was okay. The next madam comes up. What you want? Can't close the house up. We owe out money here. Each madam received, except Mrs. Meehan, £40, right, to close up. So that's it. The deal is done. So Frank Duff is down in the area to see that the madams keep their word. They didn't. 2 of the madams are still opened, right? And Frank Duff was standing there, and this guy called the Puzzler Hamilton comes out to him and says, hey, Frank, I work for Madam So-and-so. You're giving her 40 quid. And he said, that's right. Keep your 40 quid. He said, it's 1,500 of us still in business. He said, we don't have that money. Well, he said, we're in business. So that's what brings Frank Duff to the police. And he says, look, we're being blackmailed. And so the Commissioner of Police was W.R.E. Murphy at the time, and he rings down to Store Street. He gets the Superintendent Ennis on the phone. He said, Ennis, I want the area closed up. And puts down the phone and tells Frank Duff and the priest that's going to happen. So Duff is down the area knowing that at 12 o'clock at night there's going to be a big raid. But when he's down there, he's approached by a policeman on the beat who tells Frank Duff, listen, don't say where you got this from. the lads in Store Street are not going to put any effort into it. They're going to come in, kick in a few doors, break a few windows and cause a bit of trouble. But they're not putting effort into it. Why? Because like everybody else, they were using the brothels. And because the madams thought that when the British was gone, they were in the new Free State, they were nothing. But just like the British, the Free State Army were using the brothels just like that. So Frank Duff then went back to the commissioner. He told him what was happening. He rang the Store Street again. He got Ennis on the phone. He said, Ennis, Monto better close with the full figures of the law. Your head is on the block. Your job is gone. So on the 12th of March 1925, hundreds of police rolled into Monto and they raided the remaining 2 brothels that were open. There was a newspaper headlines in the Irish Independent the following morning, and it said, unsavoury houses raided, 120 people arrested. Now, we know from some of the stuff that there was a TD caught up in the raid, but he said he was only down there for the drink, he wasn't down for the women. Right? So anyway, but basically, all of them were taken up to the Bridewell, and Duff come up with a plan. The police said to Frank, we have all the clients, we have madams, we have the women, what do you want to do? He said, give the women an opportunity, he says, that they can sign up to come to my hostel or Mountjoy. So the police go around the cells and they say, where do you want to go to? Mountjoy? Or do you want to go to the Frank Duff's hostel? So the hostel. So he said, what about the clients? He said, you can let them go. And what about the 2 madams we have? He says, you can charge them. So in the whole history of Monto, 2 madams got charged. A Mrs. McKenna and a Polly Butler. Mrs. McKenna got off on a technicality, and Polly Butler got 6 weeks in Mountjoy prison for running houses for moral purposes. And then Frank Duff, now they were closed down, so Frank Duff organised the final march into Monto. And then eventually, but when they marched in, they came to a big dividing wall. Because when the houses were built, when the new social housing was built in Monto, they built a whole 25-foot wall, the length of the street, all the way down. Something like what Donald Trump was trying to do. They had it right through the area. And so it kept the lower class brothels from the new social housing. So they came there on the march, the big procession through the streets. The priest got up and he addressed the people of the area, and he said, good people of the area, we cleansed this area for you. We want you to keep it clean for future generations. So when he got off the table, Frank Duff got up on the table and he said, can someone get me a chair? So they got him a chair, and he stood up in the chair, he took out a hammer and a big spike, and he drove her into the back wall, and they hung the crucifix that they carried through into Monto on the wall as the solemn taking of Monto back for the people. The crucifix today is in the Regina Chaley Hostel, and there's a plaque underneath it to say where it came from, the whole. And then Monto was eventually closed down. But what happened to the madams? They went nowhere. Every madam owned its shops. They were money lenders, right? They were costumers to women at some stage as well. So then comes around the Eucharistic Congress, Mrs. Meehan, and some of the madams could be seen leading the processions through Monto, right? The religious processions, right? What about the pimps? They're no longer carrying cutthroat razors or rosary beads. I said they're no longer carrying cutthroat razors and lead pipes. They're carrying rosary beads, and they're evangelized. So the whole area settles down. They build the flat complexes of Liberty House flats and St. Mary's mansions, and then they start to rehouse the people over. And so Monto was finally gone.
Terry, if anyone was ever to do a history of Dublin in 100 objects, the crucifix that was carried through Monto is definitely one of them.
One of them, yeah.
Extraordinary
Oh, it is,
history.
yeah.
The other question I have was, did they ever find out who did they ever name the TD?
No, that we know of.
The GAA Vigilance Committee members, if they were ever caught in Deadlian Park watching a game of soccer that they weren't meant to be at, they would always say things like, oh, I'm only here to see who else is here. I heard a rumour that there were other fellas in the Vigilance Committee that were coming down to watch the Garrison game.
Yeah.
So he should have run with that one, you know.
Yeah.
I heard there were other TDs hanging out around Monto. Before I introduce the last musical act, can you give us an idea of when you do your tours? Because your tours down there are quite legendary. And when you're on these walking tours around Monto, you play these clips, you bring it to life. What's actually left down there?
There's one house still standing in Monto, right? And it was used. A family lived in it, and then it became a lower class brothel, and then eventually, a guy called Daly ran a brush factory in it, and it's still standing there on Beaver Street. It's the last house still standing on Monto, and it's owned by the bank. So the chances of getting that for a museum. So we have the original artifacts of Monto, all stored, and some of them are in garden sheds, some of them are in garages, and they're lying there the last 3 years. And we're trying to get the museum back open. And we make all these recordings available to people that do research. We don't charge for them. Yep. We don't. And it's free into the museum. You don't charge you for that either. So basically what we do is we walk on the way of getting the walking tours, and that helps. So when the museum was open, it was all voluntary. There was no salary in it. But basically, when we closed it up, we came under pressure for to hand over all the recordings that we did, and I wouldn't give them over. No, because it belongs to the area. Because we didn't know where they were going, and we weren't giving them to anybody in any way. So they remain in the area. So the management committee decided that we'd close up the museum to save the recordings, and that's what we did. So the museum is closed up. So hopefully we get it opened again at some stage.
A friend of mine, Fergus Whelan, always says about me, because I love putting up plaques, he says, a plaque on all your houses. Yeah. And you've done a pretty good job at that down in Monto, and you can walk these streets, and you can stand where Philip Shanahan's was, you know where May Oblong's was. All of that is just great work, and I think you're a real champion of social history and oral history, and beloved of the people in that area. You just have to say, you don't say Terry Fagan, you say Monto Terry. Monto Terry been around today. That's how they know you down there. Yeah. And you're a real hero of mine, actually, in terms of history in Dublin.
Thank you.
Please, a big bull of bus for Terry Fagan. So there's... If we were in a bookies, there would have been very short odds on what the last song would be at an event like this. Fresh from a series of sold-out gigs with the historian Lorcan Collins in the International. You've one more to go, I think. Songs of the Revolution, they're doing them together. It's a great privilege to ask my friend Phelim Drew to sing us out.
Your permission to say a few words before I sing or attempt to sing the song. As Donal and MacDara said, the song Monto was written by George D. Hodnett, and both my parents knew Hoddy, as he was affectionately known, and he was well liked. And my mother acted in the Pike Theatre and ran helped to run the coffee shop there, which subsidised the theatre. And she would have known Hoddy well. But she was disgusted with him once when he came to a Dubliners concert in the Olympia as he was a reviewer for the Irish Times. And he slept through the entire performance and wrote in his roundup of gigs that he'd seen of the Dubliners the next day in the Times that it was the same old stuff. Luke Kelly was, thought of, he was a big fan of communism, and my father, Ronnie, was identified more with socialism. He was a champion of the underdog. But unfortunately, when Hoddy turned up after a show, drunk one night, demanding royalties for the Monto, they told him to fuck off. And Ronnie told me a lovely story, which I'll tell very quickly, about Hoddy, which was that during the Second World War, the country, the city of Dublin in particular, was on high alert for fear that the Luftwaffe would mistake Dublin for Liverpool, as it did on a couple of occasions on South Circular Road and the North Strand. But Hoddy played a number of instruments: the piano, the zither, apparently, and the trombone. But he was practicing the trumpet, much to the annoyance of his neighbours. So he took an opportunity one night, and he was a bohemian in the true sense of the word. He challenged the notion of 9 to 5 work, and indeed day and night. And he walked out on Sandymount Strand when the tide was out, and he walked out as far as he could to practice his trumpet in the middle of the night. And the Gardaí Síochána bore down on him in a number of Black Mariahs and arrested him. The charge was sending signals to German U-boats So I've got my own technique for playing this banjo, which I call JWI, just whack it. Well, if you've got a wing, oh, take her up the ring, oh, where the waxy sing, oh, all the day. If you had your fill of porter and you can't go any further, give your man the order back to the quay and take her up to Monto, Monto, Monto. Take her up to Monto, Langaroo, to you. You heard of the buckshot Foster, the dirty owl imposter. He took a mott and lost her up the Furry Glen. He first put on his bowler and he buttoned up his trousers and he whistled for a growler and he said, my man, take me up to Monto. You can all join him. Oh, Monto, take me up to Monto, Langaroo, to you. You seen the Dublin Fusiliers, the dirty old bamboozeliers. They went and got the childer, 1, 2, 3. Marching from the linen hall, there's one for every cannonball. Vicky's going to send yous all o'er the sea. But first go up to Monto, Monto, Monto. First go up to Monto, Langaroo, to you. When Carey told and skinned the goat, O'Donnell put him on the boat. He never should have been afloat, the dirty skite. It wasn't very sensible to tell on the Invincibles. They stood up for the principles day and night. Take her up to Monto, Monto, Monto. Take her up to Monto, Langaroo, to you. When the Tsar of Russia and the King of Prussia landed in the park in a big balloon, they asked the Polish band to play the Wedding of the Green, but the buggers in the depot didn't know the tune. Take her up to Monto, Monto, Monto. Take her up to Monto, Langaroo, to you. The Queen, she came to call on us. She wanted to see all of us. I'm glad she didn't fall on us. She's 18 stone. Why, Mr. Me Lord Mayor, she is this all you've got to show to me? Why, no, ma'am, there's some more to see. Pogue Mahone. So take me up to Monto, Monto, Monto. Take me up to Monto, Langaroo. Good afternoon to you.